There we go. So welcome to GPI's 2020 election series. And for those of you who don't know, the Global Policy Institute is USC's premier student-run think tank on international relations and global issues. And our team of fellows works year-round to report on current news and host programming events like this one that bring in a wide range of speakers. And so this is the second in a series of 5 events discussing key foreign policy issues pertaining to the US election that we feel deserve special coverage. And so stay tuned for upcoming events that are coming in the weeks to follow. And today, as you all probably know, which is why you're here, we will focus on the upcoming election and US climate change foreign policy, or maybe a lack of it. And so I kind of said this before, but the way this is going to work is essentially we're going to give a little bit of background on climate change to make sure everyone's on the same page, some climate science and context. But that's going to be very brief. And then, because I'm sure a lot of you are well-versed in this, and then we want this to be a discussion. And so I have some questions prepared that are centered around climate change and US foreign policy and the election. But myself and the panelists really want this to be a conversation, as I already mentioned, in a discussion. So please use the chat box and raise your hand in the raise your hand feature and contribute questions and comments and stuff like that. And I have some questions prepared, but that I think will lead us in an interesting direction, but we are totally okay with this conversation going anywhere you all want it to go. And if there's a topic that you want to hear more about or go more in depth about, please don't hesitate to ask, and myself and the speakers will do our best to oblige. So after that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have Dan Mazmanian, who's a professor at the USC Global Policy School of Public Policy. He's a widely published scholar in the field of policy implementation and environmental policy. His current research focuses on climate change policy, which is great. And he's the recipient of the Wildavsky Enduring Contribution Award from the American Political Science Association and the Thomas R. Dye Service Award from the Policy Studies Organization. And he now serves as the chair of USC's Presidential Working Group on Sustainable Education, Research and Operations, a collaborative effort to develop a comprehensive university-wide approach to sustainability. And we have also Wendy Abrams, an environmentalist and social activist. And stemming from a commitment to the Clinton Global Initiative, she founded Cool Globes, a nonprofit designed to raise awareness of climate change using public art and education. She helped establish the Abrams Environmental Clinic at the University of Chicago to address environmental problems to the Great Lakes region. And over the past 2 decades, she has served on many boards, including names that I'm sure you will recognize, like Waterkeeper Alliance, the National Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, Field Museum of Natural History, Center for American Progress Action Fund, and some more. And in 2020, she took on the role as adjunct professor at USC, teaching a class on activism and advocacy. So, long intro, but Professors Abrams and Mazmanian, welcome and thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure.
So, like I mentioned, before we begin in earnest, I think it is important to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So my first question is basically to ask you both to provide a little context to the conversation we're going to have. And could you basically briefly give us some basic facts about climate change? What's the current state of anthropogenic climate change? What's been done about it internationally and here in the US? Where are we heading? And what do we need to do to avert the worst effects?
Wendy, I'll let you lead.
Oh, okay, I was going to let you lead because you've much of our credential, but
I just give a lecture and they don't want that.
Yeah. Well, I think we've got an informed group here, so I don't want to be, go down to too basic of a level, but I think there's an important, a couple facts to talk about just in terms of getting a sense of the urgency of climate change and where we're at. And one of the things I think is important too is just, we talk about 1 degree or 2 degrees and giving a little context to that. The Earth has warmed 1 degree over the past, since we've been recording from the pre-industrial age. So 1 degree, that's where we are right now. What Paris Accord and a lot of what we're trying to do is to stay at 1.5 degrees of change or 2 degrees. Also, this is in Celsius. But again, just to give you a sense that doesn't sound like, so what, it's 75 degrees or 76, what's the big deal? And I like to use the analogy of the human body, that the Earth's ecosystem is somewhat analogous to a person with a fever. If you were supposed to be 98.6 degrees and you have a 1 degree fever, you're not at your best, you're feeling a little, not quite perfect, but you're highly functional. You probably go to work that day. At 2 degrees, maybe you go to work, maybe you call in sick. You're not deathly ill, but you're under the weather. 3, 4 degrees, you really are sick. You're in bed. Your ability to function is compromised. And when you start getting up 5, 6, 7 degrees, you're really talking about what's critical and life-threatening. And I think those numbers apply to the Earth's ecosystem as well. We're going to be at 1 degree. We're hoping to avoid 2 degrees. And then we start heading into 3, 4. We're really heading into some serious scenarios. If you go a few degrees past that, you're talking about hopefully not the most likely scenario, but not beyond the realm of possibilities that that life. If you get to 7 degree change, it's life on Earth could be uninhabitable for certain species, including humans. So there's some serious concerns about where we're at. Dan, I'll let you chime in.
First of all, I think you're right. I just want to add to that, which is I think that we be clear about our nomenclature, what we're talking about. We call it climate change, because the climate has always been changing, depending on your time horizon. I think what we're talking about as a human civilization on the planet is the accelerating rate of climate change. And of course, the most dramatic examples are occurring as we speak. We're most of us, I presume, are in California. I'm here in Southern California. I'm not in Northern California, although I have concerns about Northern California personally. But the fact is the extent and rate of forest fires has exceeded even the most dramatic projections of only 10 to 20 years ago as a consequence of the accelerating rate of climate change. So the conversation is about the accelerating rate. And back to Wendy's comment, so what do we do if we're concerned about an accelerating rate of something that's harmful to the human, by the way, civilization that we know? And I say human because the planet's going to be here with or without any change in the climate. It's the human civilization that's threatened, as well as many of the biological species and all we know in terms of the living organisms of the planet. But the planet's still going to be here. So the question is, what do we do about the rate of change? And that's the conversation we should be having now.
And to your point, if I can add in, Megan, if you want to share the screen, we had a chart exactly to your point, Dan, about the rate of change. Because when you talk to people particularly people who are climate deniers, and hopefully there are few and far between or diminishing number of them, but people will talk about how the climate has always been changing. The carbon levels have been changing throughout the history of Earth. And one of the things that you'll notice, and I'm not sure we can pull up this graph, but if you look at the ice cores and the carbon emissions over the last 600,000 years, it has fluctuated over the millennium. But we are now at a point in time where it is so above and beyond any of the fluctuations that we've ever had on the planet that we're really in uncharted territory. So that's, again, just to your point.
Yeah. So the conversation, especially about the election, is what does the election have to do with any of this and have to do with dealing with the rate of change? I mean, exactly. I believe that's our conversation today, Karen, and so I'll just let you lead off with your question. For those of you who haven't seen them, Karen said modestly, well, he's got almost a dozen questions here for us to keep me going for all day. So, but I'm gonna let you start. We'll try and be, quick in response, but I think it will open up to other questions and conversation.
Yeah, I think so. That's great. I think broadly, the beginning to get into, I think it's interesting to talk about, the presidential nominees' respective climate policies, or a lack of one, I guess. So could you fill us in a little bit? What has Biden, pledged to do, and what has Trump pledged to do and done so far?
So I'll take a crack at it, Wendy, and then we'll I really want to elevate that a little bit to understand, to say to everybody, you know, you're not going to learn everything by what they say specifically on the campaign trail or even in their respective parties' platforms, because those are about getting votes and putting together a coalition that'll make a difference in what they want. So I'm really interested in what they're committed to and how believable it is. And it seems to me in this conversation, I look for three things in terms of the commitment. Is there actually a commitment to addressing the accelerating rate of climate change? Is there a commitment to that? Not how they're going to do it. We can talk about that. Two, is there a commitment to carbon neutrality in that? Because it is about fossil fuels and CO2 emissions that is the heart of the rate of change. Is there a commitment to sustainability which goes well beyond simply the science and reality of climate change, but the effects, about equity and justice, about where we live, about how we eat, about our own security and well-being? So I look for the commitment to these issues first, and then we can talk about the policies. And then I ask myself, do the candidates suggest by what they say and what they do and what their history is, they're going to walk the talk? I know there's a great deal of skepticism about politicians. By the way, we're at a university. There's a great deal of skepticism about deans and presidents too. I understand all that. There's skepticism about leadership. There should be, if you will, thoughtful questions to leaders. But that's what I look for. I look for the commitment to carbon neutrality, to sustainability, and to pledging to walking the talk. So the candidates, all I know so far is that Donald Trump has assured me as a voter, he's looking backward. You know, he's trying to unwind, I believe there's 100 federal rules and regulations that try to deal with the accelerating rate of change, climate change. So all I know is he's had a history of undoing what prior administrations have tried to do. He's pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord 2015 that our prior president signed. Interestingly enough, our Congress didn't sign off, so we're really not pledged to it. It's a presidential decree, and he's decreed he's bailing out. And in contrast, we have Joe Biden. Now, he's not a lifelong environmentalist, but he is talking about a 1.7 to 2 something trillion investment in going forward in ways that are going to deal with the accelerating rate through all sorts of issues that are important. Many of them have to do with energy, and then employment, and then new workforces for the new economy. So all I know is that contrast. Mm-hmm. And I put that up against what I'm looking for. I'm not going to tell you who I favor, but I'm telling you that when asked, that's what I look at.
Yeah, I agree. I think the contrast could not be more stark. President Trump does not try to even sugarcoat what he is trying to do for climate change. He will flat out say climate change is a hoax, and he has no plan to address it. And he's unabashed in his, he's proud of that. He will tell you that his plan is to promote more fossil fuel use. So he doesn't even put anything, it's not even a question of fulfilling his pledges. He is pledging not to do anything. And as Professor Mazmanian said, he's unraveling any progress that had been made in the past. A couple things I think, and to your point, we will see if there is a President Biden, what he is able to do. What he is pledged to do are three overall caps is an enforcement mechanism, including milestones and targets by 2025. I think that is helpful to have measures in place, because even if the goal is to say we will be carbon neutral by 2050, which seems to me rather far out, I think the certainty that these mechanisms are in place is somewhat as effective as it doesn't matter really when they go into place, as much as just we know that they will be in place, so that states and corporations start gearing up because they figure they're going to have to accommodate this sooner rather than later, or sooner or later. And then I think there are very real, tangible opportunities for investment and research in research and development within the energy, with whether it's the Department of Energy or even the government acquisition. The government procurement office spends $500 billion a year. That's a lot of money. If the government decides they want all their vehicles to be electric, if every government building were more energy efficient, if our military vehicles were more energy efficient, there's so many ways that the government, that in and of itself, they're such big, their procurement office is so big and they have so much ability to, if there was a new technology that the government decided, oh, there's a new XYZ, you know, better solar technology, if they converted to that, that would instantly create an economies of scale for production. So I think that their commitment to that will help promote innovation in that regard as well.
Great. That's a great first look. And it really seems to be a, like you guys mentioned, a stark difference in the candidates. But regardless, you know, I want to zoom in a little bit more micro before blowing back up to a nationwide scale. But regardless of political orientation, you know, what kind of climate-friendly policies should concerned citizens look out for in their elected officials in general? You know, regardless of, I always vote Republican, always vote Democrat, what kind of policies are best, you know, from a president to as small as you know, a municipality and a mayor?
I think that's a fascinating question, if I may. And I, by the way, is a very difficult one, probably the most difficult one for any politician to address forthrightly. And I'll tell you why. Because any elected politician, let's just take in California and Los Angeles, we're dealing with COVID, we're dealing with equity justice, we're dealing with jobs, we're dealing with the here and now. So any politician has to balance that against thinking and making commitments to the future. It's simply a tension that always exists. And it exists because we have real people who are living real lives, many of them very difficult, whose well-being is number one on their mind, and it should be, from a humanitarian point of view, on our minds. So if you ask a politician to spend their entire time committing to the future and setting out plans that are aggressive, for instance, as our mayor in the Los Angeles New Deal, Green New Deal for Los Angeles, you know, you have to applaud him for even doing that in the midst of dealing with all the other real world issues. And if you think that, that I'm overstating that we have to be concerned about the here and the now, our university president, Carol Folt, spends most of her time dealing with the issues of where students are going to learn, how we're going to maintain online education, what are we going to do about the dorms, what are we doing with all our employees who we have furloughed? Do we bring them back? What do we owe our faculty? Do we cut their wages more than we've already done? By the way, the wages were cut for faculty to deal with the budget situation. But all the things that are very real for people, while we're saying, as it turns out, the rate of climate change is not going to be modified unless we act now. How can we get those greenhouse gases from ever being emitted today to reduce the problems in the future? This is a real simple tug of war. So you have to have real strong commitment and backing by people in your community who agree with you that we have to make some sacrifices now. Two, whatever we do, and action on climate change really has to be together with equity and justice. There's no moral grounds for saying, I'm going to cut my carbon emissions by buying a $100,000 Tesla and not say that others should have the same opportunity. Or I'm going to move to where the air emissions is less severe. Or, by the way, where the sea level rise is going to be less prominent. I can do all those things because I'm wealthy, but I'm not going to worry about everyone else. That's unconscionable. Furthermore, politically, it's very difficult. So politicians are struggling to help the here and now in ways that help reduce the rate of climate change. This is it's not one or the other. Everybody talks about trade-offs. They are not trade-offs. They have to go together. Now, which are the best or most efficient, have the best return? That's the question, not is it one or the other.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I would just build upon the idea that it's not one or the other, that I think that environment and economy are so intertwined. I would also think that while it's difficult because elected officials have so many issues, as you point out, to deal with, if they truly act as leaders, and too often elected officials follow public sentiment as opposed to lead it. But if they are truly leaders, then their job should be to lead and say that not only is this possible, but the best thing for our economy is to create green infrastructure and create new jobs that build our renewable energy infrastructure, that develop new technologies, because not only will we save money by having new technologies, but we can sell them to the global market. We don't sell oil, we do sell natural gas, but we're not the world's largest provider of oil. And, we've for years have been importing that. That's probably one of the reasons why the 3 countries that didn't sign Paris were, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, because they're predominantly dependent upon oil revenues. So I think it's a huge opportunity. And if our leaders really position in that to our constituents, not only, they should also talk about the cost of ignoring climate change too, and not talk about why this is a cost. One of the questions I noticed in the chat room, and I just want to mention this because I think it's a good question, is why did Biden not support the Green New Deal? I can't tell you exactly what his motivations were, but I will tell you my own perception of the Green New Deal when I first heard it announced by AOC and Senator Markey was that, and I've been a climate activist for 20 years, so anything that raises the profile of the urgency of addressing climate change is a good thing. But what I personally think was flawed in that was that they threw the kitchen sink in it, that they didn't talk about the climate crisis in a focused way. And let me give you an analogy. If we had a crisis with a foreign country, right? I'm making this up. I don't want to pick on any foreign country. Let's say, Syria, I may throw that out of hat. If we were invaded, or do we need to have military action because this country is a threat to us? We decide what that threat is and if it is worthy of taking action or not. And if we decide to take action, the military takes action. We don't say, well, how much is the bomb? And how many bombs are we going to spend? And how much is the taxes going to go up for each individual American when we bomb that country? Because this is what it's going to cost in order to react to that crisis. We should talk about climate change and have a plan to address it. And then how we fund things, whether it's taxes, where the revenues come from, let the Treasury, let the Congress figure out our tax revenues and things like that. But those two things should not, in my mind, should not be in the same conversation, because it also says climate change, you're being penalized by addressing climate change, and we're not being penalized. We're being penalized, I think, if we don't address it. So that's what I thought was the flaw of the Green New Deal. And quite frankly, I applaud Biden for acknowledging that.
Well, let me just say, I think the leadership issue is critical that you started on mentioning, and I'll come to the Green New Deal in a moment. But the leadership is critical. It's those leaders, and they're public and private and nonprofits, those leaders who can both anticipate and believe the science and therefore know what the challenge looks like in action, and imagine and cultivate strategies through policy, through funding, through focusing attention on solutions. And it seems to me that we're already seeing that in many, many ways. The substantial move to renewable energy across the planet. Today, any country that is looking to invest anew in energy does so first with renewable, second with gas. Coal is not on the drawing board. Maybe nuclear, which is very controversial for other reasons, but it's not greenhouse gas emitting in operation. It is when building and so forth. So in fact, the carbon neutral energy is the leading source of energy on the planet. So you might ask yourself, well, where does leadership come into this? Well, when we have a president that says, for political reasons, I'm going to support coal in the United States, he hasn't been able to save West Virginia coal, honestly. But if you look to India, we're talking about now, this is international relations. The largest threat to greenhouse gas emissions increasing in the next 10 years is India. It's not China, it's not the United States, it's India. Why? Because India believes it's their right as a nation, it's their right for their people that they join what we might call developed status well-being. In other words, bring their society up in terms of capacity in that way. And they have an enormous stock of coal, and they have a huge workforce in coal. So their argument is they have the right to burn their coal to accelerate their energy development as the least cost strategy. So now we're at international relations, where I think many of the students you are, is to say, well, what should we be doing then to help them offset that perverse incentive? It's perverse. It's because they control the coal, because they have those workers. If you don't have a workforce transformation policy for India, if you don't have an alternative to getting them new technologies other than having them buy them from Western countries or China, if you don't have that, why should they behave differently? And you can say because they're making it worse for all of us, which I do say all the time. Mm-hmm. But making it worse for all of us doesn't really deal with their problem. So international relations is working together for mutual solutions to those problems. So I look for a president who's willing to use the powers of our nation to leverage, incentivize, participate, not simply transfer money, but find ways of encouraging development in China the way we're talking about doing in California. I mean, in India, the way we're doing in California. China already has its goal, although it's way out on the horizon, but it's 2060. So China's actually made the shift. They still have more coal than we do by leagues, but they're transitioning. India does not aspire to go beyond coal for the next decade or so, they say, until we get to a new plateau. But that's going to be too late for all of us. So when it comes to election, and it comes to presidents, and it comes to international relations, they all come together with someone who's going to take leadership on behalf of our nation in this arena.
Thank you. I want to move on to some of the participant comments, because we're getting a number. Serena is saying that she worries that long-term goals may not last as successive presidents either don't believe in climate change or they don't prioritize it. So, yeah. I mean, and this is a question that stretches far beyond just the climate change arena. I mean, how do you enact long-lasting change and deal with problems that have much longer time horizons than simply a president's term within those limited 4 years?
That's absolutely critical. And by the way, California is an example of how to do it, but it doesn't guarantee we will do it as a nation. California, if you look back at our climate policy, goes back to the 1970s. We've had a succession of Democrat, Republican governors and legislatures who have, to one degree or another, all been on the same page in moving us toward environmental protection and now climate policy. You know, our climate change policy that started in 2006 was by Arnold Schwarzenegger, Republican, carried on by Jerry Brown, Democrat. And so that you're right, there has to be continuity in leadership. Now the question is, why does that happen in California and not elsewhere? Well, I've done a little bit of research on California's history in this respect, and it's really because of two additional factors. In other words, what prompts leaders to step forward? Are they just unique Californians? And I think not so. There are two other things. Because the public is concerned about the quality of our environment, about the air we breathe, about the outdoors we have, has been since the 1970s, in a very vocal way. Two, actually our state has institutions that have become prominent worldwide in dealing with these issues. We have a Commission on Energy, we have a Public Utilities Commission, We have a Department of Environment and Resources. We have Mary Nichols, who's head of our California Air Resources Board, has been at this now from through the last 3 governors. We've had stability, and we have, by the way, I know SC is a great university, please forgive me when I'm going to say, we've had the University of California university system, where much of the research on climate change has been conducted at the UC campuses, not at USC, especially if you go back to the 20 years. For the last 20 years, most of the research that has really made a difference in understanding the effects of climate change has been conducted because USC has been, it's much larger. SC is getting into the game. We're trying, but that actual research has been conducted because we have a wonderful worldwide state university system. We have institutions of government that are dedicated to the truth, to the science, to the implementation of policy. We have shrewd politicians who aren't afraid to cut a deal, okay? They're not afraid to cut a deal with industry and the environmentalists and the public to move the ball forward. I will just say about the policy, because I know many of those deals have been cut, that the best is the enemy of the good. And as you really hold out for the best, you don't get anything. My experience is take the good and run with it. So in terms of the long-term commitments of presidents or elected leaders, Karen, where you began with this, if you get policies set in place for 10, 15 years and say, but it should be 50, I would say yes, but first perform. California would not have renewed its climate change policies in 2020. We would not have done it if we weren't successful in accomplishing what we set out as our goals from 25 and 6 to 2019. So performance matters. So the answer is, how do we know what will continue? If we head down the right path, it takes on a life of its own. It really does.
I just want to
matters.
Sorry about that.
Professor Abrams?
No, I just, thank you. I agree with what you've said. And I wanted to just pick up a comment also in the chat room, a comment from Professor Lammy about, and Tristan about the money in politics, and that I believe the statistic, and I'm surprised it wasn't even higher, between renewables and fossil fuels is 13-1, that fossil fuel industry spends 13 times as much as any renewable energy in terms of supporting candidates, and that the overwhelming amount, the vast majority of money from fossil fuel industry to politicians goes to Republican, I'm talking on the federal level, is about 3-1, 3/4 go to Republican candidates. I think in forgive me, Professor Lemmy, you might probably know, 2014 or 2016, none of the Republican senators were willing to say that climate change is caused by human-related activities. Some were willing to acknowledge that climate change was real, but not all were willing to even admit that. So that shows you the power of the fossil fuel industry. I also, when they talked about the biggest recipients of money from the fossil fuel industry, they went to presidential candidates. And if you look at Mitt Romney, I think was the top of the list in terms of who received the most funding as a presidential candidate from the fossil fuel industry. When he was governor of Massachusetts in the early 2000s, he was extraordinarily good on climate change. He was one of the governors that signed the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And then when he became a presidential candidate, he retreated from that, because I think that the politics are such that and if you ask why they do it, here's a list of, if you look at the senators who received money, Joe Manchin's the only Democrat on that list. Everyone else is a Republican. So the money skews heavily in one favor. And the fossil fuel industry does that intentionally, because if they argue fact versus fiction, they lose 0 to 100. They have no grounds to stand on from a scientific standpoint. So if they make the argument political, in this case, they're going to win 52 to 48, and they win, based on party line, not based on science.
So if we have a democratic society and you want to counter the power of money, you have a number of choices, but they really mostly have to do with your own participation and voting. And so it seems to me that your generation, I'm speaking to all the students here, your generation has a real strong interest in reducing the rate of climate change and to an extent adapting to that change. And unless you have the kind of wealth of vested interests, which really is what the fossil fuel industry is all about, vested interest. We understand it in a rational way, but that doesn't mean we agree with it morally or in terms of the future. You have to act. If you don't vote, if you don't voice to your friends and your parents why it's important for everybody to think about not only their immediate situation, which in many cases is pretty bad given the fires and so forth, or the hurricanes, but in fact, if we don't stand up as a republic, as people, then of course we have no one left to blame but ourselves. So I really understand power, and as I say, the trade-offs, and they've happened in California, they happen in Los Angeles, they happen at USC in making trade-offs for next year's budget, and how we're going to deal with a deep hole caused by COVID and extra money with less income. We're dealing with it every place. That doesn't stop Carol Folt as president of our institution for saying to me, as chair of the working group, let's pursue this. We have to look over the horizon. It doesn't stop our mayor, it doesn't stop our governor, it does stop our president. So now we're back to 2020. We're back to 2020. It's all about the election. For Senate in particular, and for the presidency. I'd say particular because I think the House, you have to watch that closely too, but currently the preponderance of you in the House is in favor of acting as aggressively as possible within all these constraints to mitigate and reduce the impact. So this is a good series. It's about the election.
Yeah, I'd like to continue that a little bit because, I think some of that's what's been brought up both in the comments and by the speakers is this polarization around climate change as an issue. And I'd like to pull some statistics just for some context here. So according to recent polls conducted by the Pew Research Center, 67% of US adults say the federal government is doing too little to reduce the effects of global climate change, while 52% say that Congress should make addressing climate change a top priority. So these statistics show that, if the majority of people believe that climate change is a serious threat, why is it so low on the priority list of elected officials? And why has there not been enough federal legislation to address climate change?
So I think you've heard the answer already, but I'll repeat it to some extent. There's the historic role of the fossil fuel industry in the politics of our nation, all right? And as a vested interest, as an industry interest. I don't think you'd find any of the deniers or ostensible deniers who'd say, I want to make the world worse. But then you ask them if they're willing to give up their income for it, or their perks, or and that's a different issue. You see, the economic interest versus their moral beliefs and beliefs in science. Two, you have the difficulty of changing any policy because our system is designed, if you will, to curb rapid change, although we see Donald Trump trying to unwind all of those provisions in the national government today. But the checks and balances are designed to slow, not to speed things up. We've designed a government that was built on the idea of curbing the power of government, and now we're asking government to act. So there's always that tension. And third is this is about us. This is about changing behavior. I'm fascinated. I've often given in all my classes that survey of people's carbon footprint, individuals. How many of you had it? Raise your hand if you had that carbon footprint. Okay. Well, I don't know about the classes you've been in, but the classes I've run, it turns out always there's a couple outliers. A couple students who kind of embarrassingly raise their hand because they've got these scores that are off the scoreboard. Why do they have them? It turns out they are not from Southern California. Mm-hmm. They are from around the nation and around the planet, and they do it through air miles. So, what are we going to ask of them? Well, online helps them reduce their carbon footprint. I should tell you that and Steve will appreciate this, I once embarrassed my successor dean at Price School, because I was the dean of Price School. And I had a conversation with incoming students. And I asked the same question about, and I said, you know, you don't even have to show me. I know who has the highest footprint in the room. And everybody said, how do you know this, Dan? I said, because it's our dean. The dean of the Price School had the highest footprint of the faculty and the students in the room. Why? Because the dean is on a plane, I'd say 25% of his living days going around the country and the world on behalf of the school to be involved and engage worldwide and to raise money and to raise money. And by the way, to raise money. So I knew the answer, but the point is, how do you curb that? It's our behavior. How do you get your parents and your friends and maybe you to decide eating beef is not good for the planet? I have this conversation in my home. It is not an easy conversation. My wife likes to say, I'll have it at lunch without you. And because I'm going to have my beef, and I'm saying, well, yeah, just don't do it in my presence. So I'm in denial about this at home. I know what's going on. Think of everybody who doesn't want to change their behavior, who's worried about loss more than they're imagining the gain from us all doing better. That is part of the human experience. So it's all these things. It's not one of them. We have to change. We have to voice change. We have to elect politicians who will take a risk, and then we have to support them. And we have to know there will always be some deniers, a lot of money's vested interest for the next 15 to 20 years. It's not going to go away tomorrow. The fossil fuel industry is not going away tomorrow. It will slowly phase. Changing the investment of USC out of fossil fuels. It's going on. I promise you it is, but it's not public, but it is going on. And everywhere else where we can. I mean, these things take time.
I think also I would say the flip side of that is why there hasn't been change. I do think it's happening more rapidly because of the youth activism and because your voice is being heard. And I think those things matter. I think the government is paying more attention. Corporations are paying more attention. I do think we as individuals need to look at our own carbon footprint. But I don't think it's realistic to think that we're going to live in a world where there won't be air travel. I think the idea of saying, hey, Department of Energy, some of these problems which are harder to solve as an individual, we need our government to solve through research and development, through more investment in biofuels and innovation. And I do think that that will happen. It's a question of saying, what are we going to invest over the next 30 years? Let's front load that investment, put more money into research over the next 5 to 10 years so that we have the ability to adopt those technologies, to sell those technologies globally. And I think that that is happening. I'm cautiously optimistic that if we are lucky enough to have a President Biden, that those investments will happen. Well, I don't think he's been on the forefront leading the climate revolution. I do believe that he understands the seriousness of the issue and the magnitude of the problem. And I think under the difference under President Obama and when he was Vice President Biden is that they didn't have the support of Congress. And not to say, you know, who knows what will happen with the House and Senate, but that was a big difference, is that really what they had to do with the Clean Power Plan and Paris, so much of it was through executive action, not through congressional legislation.
It's a 51 vote in the Senate issue today.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me that if we're looking for national leadership, I think the choice is pretty clear. And if you really want to deal with that accelerating rate of climate change, I mean, the choice there is pretty clear. What's not so obvious to people is that the Paris Accord, getting back into it, as Biden said he would immediately upon election or taking office, doesn't quite capture what's needed. Relating back to an earlier question, is it law? Because law is much harder to change than executive order. And we need 51 votes in the Senate to pass that kind of a commitment to an international accord. International agreements require the Senate's concurrence, and no president's had it up to this point. So yeah, these are big issues.
There was a great question by Sophia that I'd like to highlight. She said, could you speak more to the intersections of the climate crisis and social inequity? How do you think environmentalists and politicians can work with other advocates, those interested in racial justice, income inequity, for example, to ultimately bring about positive change for both causes? Many environmental groups face criticism in the continuity of the Black Lives Matter movement. So where do you see all these groups working together?
One project that, one initiative that has recently been announced by Governor Newsom, and Sophia, and I don't know who else was in my class, had the opportunity to hear from Josh Friday, who is the Chief Service Officer under Governor Newsom and has crafted this initiative. It's called the California Climate Corps. They just announced it about 2 weeks ago, and they hope to launch it in early 2021. It's basically AmeriCorps public service matched with climate projects. And one of the nice things about that, to your point, is that they have 3 pillars to address with this. And one is environmental justice, so that not only will they focus on projects that are mitigating carbon emissions, whether it be tree planting or solar installations or hardening for efficiencies, other projects, but they will specifically focus in communities of color, in low-income communities, or communities that are disproportionately affected by climate change, whether it be through sea level or forest fires. So I think that, again, that's happening on the state level under Governor Newsom, but ideally this model and his voice and initiative can be replicated in other states around the country, or even supported at a federal level. So I think politicians are hearing, again, your generation and people really speaking out about this. So I'm optimistic that will be integrated in plans in the future too.
I would just say that that's a really challenging question because we all talk about the 3's, at least have for decades: environment, equity, and economy. And there's always been a way of putting 2 together. For instance, environment and economy. In fact, we've got a lot of policy. That's what cap and trade is in terms of dealing with carbon emissions in California. It's economies and the economics argument, and a tax on fossil fuels would be an economy and equity and environment issue. It's the equity issue. How do you deal with the social inequities, the environmental, the racial inequities, the racial prejudices that have long lasting? How do you deal with them? And California actually is interesting in our state laws. Our state laws actually are very prescriptive about that today, more and more so, requiring urban planning and receipt of state money to explain how you are going to deal with inequities within your community in dealing with climate change from the money we're giving to you to adapt. Now, that's a law, but that doesn't necessarily change local politics, and I'm not saying that makes it all go away. It doesn't. But I think that it's pretty clear that if you don't have policies that are prescriptive to do this, until we become a society that does it as part of our culture, until we change that, it's going to be a battle all the time. The mobilization. Listen, there was an equity justice argument about California's most recent, the first in 2006 and the most recent in 2019, climate change policies on equity and justice grounds. Very much so. Why? Well, what is the climate change policy about? It's reducing carbon emissions. The argument of those who are being impacted in Los Angeles and other areas in California, where there was heavy industry, which there is in Los Angeles and the industrial sector, was you're talking about dealing with something up in the planet, and meanwhile, our local air quality is terrible. And you're saying we should vote for the future, which is a cleaner planet, without dealing with our immediate problem, which we've been screaming about for decades. So we actually had 2 laws that were passed. One was to say we're going to look out to 2035 and 2050. And the other separate legislation says all the money that's taken in through cap and trade, a significant portion of it has to go to those communities, 1. 2, our air quality management boards have to deal with those hotspots. Because the federal law doesn't deal with what they call hotspots, where there's concentrated pollution from industry today. And then we all have, so I think that, you know, there is an attempt to grapple with this issue. It's not easy. I think it's even harder in many ways than bringing on new technologies and so forth, and even getting other kind of behaviors to change, is dealing with equity and justice in what is a historically, racially, and economically divided society. It is. I don't want to mince any words about that. But that's part of leadership, and that's part of us.
As we're wrapping up here, because we have about 8 minutes left, and I don't want to keep anyone longer than.
We're just getting warmed up, Kieran. Okay.
Well, yeah, I could talk about this for hours. I mean, don't get me wrong, but you know, I'd like to, and if we have time after, you know, we'll see what other questions are out there. But I'd like to really raise this point that, you know, I know I'm speaking for a lot of people when I say that students and younger people often feel really frustrated by the actions and policies of leaders. And inept at changing anything. And climate change has felt like such a large problem for all of our lives, and yet it's still a large problem. And I know you're probably going to say vote, but other than voting, which is the most important thing, but I mean, what can students do to make a difference in their lives and in the short term?
Right. I think you can be an activist in anything you do, particularly when you beyond college. So if any career that you have, whether, you know, you're a product manager, design a product that's more sustainable. You're an architect, design, you know, housing or infrastructure that's more sustainable. You can be a lawyer and have lawsuits. I mean, and there's really any industry that you go into, you can have a means of addressing the issues of sustainability. So I would say you don't have to work for a nonprofit organization to be an activist or to make a difference. The other thing I would say, you know, you're one of the best universities in the world. And when corporations come to recruit you for a job, if you say, you don't need to protest them, but while you're in your job interview and they say, do you have any questions for me? And you say, yes, I'd like to know what your sustainability plan is for your company. Just by asking that question makes them realize, oh, we better have an answer to that. Because if they don't have an answer to that, I guarantee you they go back to their corporate headquarters and say, God, those really smart students at USC asked me about this and I was really embarrassed that I didn't have a good answer. And, you know, by the way, maybe you start a movement like that where you try to get every senior, you know, at universities to ask that question across the country. You'll really get corporations' attention.
So I think you need to start tomorrow. Here's what you need to do tomorrow. You have to ask yourself, where am I right now that could make a difference? And I'm going to say there's 3 places. 1 is in your personal behavior. 2 is in your family or extended friendships. Basically, trying to have this conversation about the need to change. 3rd, you're in classes. You're at USC. How many of you have lobbied me? I'm chair of the president working group. I haven't heard from you. You know, I mean, this is about mobilization. You know, you say you're a student and therefore I can't. I'm wrong. You're wrong. You're a member of this university. Are you telling your faculty? Are you telling your departments? I think we should have more classes in this area. I mean, I hate to tell you, I'm not going to give the spiel on the recommendation. We recommended already radical changes for education for every student at USC in sustainability. That's a recommendation. We're doing a pilot of it right now. And in the spring, there should be at the introductory level, which is where we started, for freshmen, there ought to be 600 students enrolling in classes that are now going to focus on sustainability in their own fields. We're doing that. But I don't see a big movement on campus, to be honest. I work with those who are pressing, I know. We have representatives of the undergraduate and the graduate students on the President's Working Group. I'm getting the message from people, but I'm not seeing the kind of aggressive mobilization that we need that is not just about climate change, but it's about sustainability, and it's about the nexus of how, in fact, if I am a political scientist in IR, can I think best about the nexus of environment, equity, justice, and global governance? I mean, you know, where's it going to come from? If you're an IR, you're not thinking about the limits of nation state governance around the planet, you're missing the big picture about how this is going to have to be dealt with. So I'd say start asking right now for help. Your voice is very, very clear on campus. It's heard. Why aren't we having classes on these subjects? Why isn't the school, the university doing more in this area? And if you don't know about what we're doing in the President's Working Group, that's part of the problem. But we are, what, 12 months and 10 days into our business. We're making a lot of recommendations that are being followed or they're starting, but it doesn't, you can't see it on the ground today very much yet. So, you know, it seems to me you learn to mobilize on campus and you'll take that with you to your job interview and you'll take that with you to your life. It's not something you're going to wait to do. It starts tomorrow. It starts tonight.
Anybody who doesn't feel like they have enough tangible action items that they want to do more on climate change, feel free to email me directly and I will give you more suggestions than you want, but we'll keep you busy.
Fantastic. Okay. So the answer is it's all of us, and to start now. Don't wait. I've heard too many young people tell me, but I'm only a student. Yeah. Well, where are you being educated? Start at home. And I mean your school home, your personal life.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have any concluding questions or comments or any feedback, especially on that last point? Maybe you know about some resources on campus or off campus.
eCore, and there's eCore on campus. There's Steve Lammy can give you some. Wendy knows them. There's a environmental studies department in Dornsife where they know a lot. You can find out from people. There is information. There's student organizations. There's faculty concerned. There's a faculty senate concerned, and there was a sustainability committee. A lot of it, they're going on, but it's not at the scale that's going to move us as fast as I personally would like to see USC move.
And I also, I know this has been said and it sounds kind of cliche, but beyond voting, this election is going to be really close. I'm really concerned about states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Colorado. So, you know, even if you're in California, my guess is all of you went to high school with somebody who's at Madison or a school in one of those states. Even if they're not a close friend of yours, reach out to anybody you know, and to the extent that not only can they vote, I live across the border from Wisconsin. I can go up and help up there, but I'm not allowed to be a poll worker unless I'm a resident. So if there are students at Madison or, you know, students in Milwaukee or some of these really key states that are going to be close, to the extent that you can, you know, you each get one person, you've got 30 more people who are out there amplifying and working. So it does matter. If you can do anything in the next few weeks, that's what I would do.
So Kieran, I just got a note that I have a meeting at 5 I'm supposed to be attending. Day is still going on. So I appreciate you giving Wendy and me the opportunity to share our thoughts with students.
Yeah, no worries. This is perfect. Wrapping up right on time, which I'm kind of surprised about, but that's wonderful how these things work out sometimes. So yeah, I'd like to thank you, Professors Mazmanian and Abrams, again. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who came, showed up, paid attention and asked questions. This was really fun for me as well. So thank you. That's the event we're doing. We recorded this. So if you want to watch it again, if you want to share it with your friends, we'll be GPI. We'll be putting out the link on our website soon. So just look up Global Policy Institute, USC, on Google and you'll find it. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.